welcome to the Tarotology podcast, your place for all things tarot, astrology, and tarot adjacent. My name is Erin, and I am happy to be your host today and to welcome you to this episode where we will be exploring the tarotology of the Texas power failure that occurred this month, February of 2021. Not to pile on to the woes of ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, but I did find this recent power failure that occurred last week in the state of Texas, courtesy of Winter Storm Uri, to be a nice little case study for what's going on in the present planetary happenings with all of this energy that we have going on in Aquarius. We have the squares that are happening between Uranus and Saturn, which is going to be happening 2 more times this year, and some of the other things going on cosmologically. So I thought it would be really fun to dedicate an episode to just looking at what was going on and how some of these archetypes manifested within this particular scenario. So let's look at that and dive on in. For those of you who are not perhaps aware, maybe you're not following the news closely or you're not really that keyed in on what's happening in the United States, earlier this week, so that would have been, I believe, starting on Sunday, February 14th, so Valentine's Day, and into the 15th, Monday, there was a massive winter storm that spread across most of the continental United States. I believe about 70% of the continental United States was experiencing snow or was in some way impacted by this massive system as it made its way through. During this time, certain locations were hit much worse than others, and in particular, Texas really took the brunt of this storm. And Texas is not really, first of all, it's a state that is known for being very independent, very self-reliant. It sort of prides itself on its self-sufficiency and being able to rely on its own infrastructure, its own resources without being too heavily dependent on the United States at large. It generally looks to the state itself to provide, which many states do generally look to the states first and foremost for assistance and guidance and everything, states' rights. But Texas, more than other states, has a reputation of being very self-reliant and self-sufficient. So because of this, the state does not really use any of the federal power reserves. It does not connect with other states' systems for resources. And I'm not sure if I'm explaining this very, very correctly. I'm sure that there's a more technical way of looking at this. I'm not as well versed in policies related to this and the politics of it. But I will just say that they generally only have and contract within their own state for much of their needs and infrastructure. Not only that, but Texas tends to be more of a warm climate. It is not used to this dramatic cold spell. It's not used to these winter systems. Now, it's definitely used to storm systems. It's very much familiar with the impact of hurricanes, with some parts of it may be a part of the tornado alley. So it is a state that can handle emergencies and can respond to emergencies and generally does so. But in this instance, it was not expecting a winter weather event as opposed to a severe weather event. Because of that, many of the buildings are not necessarily built with that in mind. Perhaps the insulation is not as adequate for, extreme temperatures as it may be in the northern states in the United States. Generally, people would not have things like fireplaces. And so that's sort of, I'm just giving you this context so that you can understand kind of the mentality of living in Texas and why this winter storm really was the perfect storm for them. In Texas, we sort of established that, again, not really equipped for winter weather scenarios as much as they would be for other weather-related situations. So when we get to what was going on this past week, first of all, there's been a lot going on in Aquarius, which I've talked about already. This week as well, we kind of added another element into the equation, and that was that Saturn squaring Uranus that I mentioned. So Uranus is in Taurus right now, where it's not particularly happy being in Taurus. Taurus is about stability. It's slow and steady. The tortoise that wins the race at the end in that story, step by step, foundational. And Uranus is very much not that way. Uranus is like the Prometheus in mythology. It is the bringer of fire, which is pretty interesting when you think about what the Texans needed this past week was heat and fire and electricity. So it is this energy that is very rapid and sudden and swift and, spares no one in its progress and its charge and it's moving forward. And anyway, so we have this conversation, this hard aspect conversation between Saturn and Aquarius and Uranus and Taurus. And meanwhile, we have all these other planets happening in Aquarius as well. We have the sun was still in Aquarius, it's now in Pisces. We had Mercury retrograde in Aquarius, and retrograde is, we talk about the Mercury retrograde period, which happens about 3 times a year, as being a time when you should engage in some reflection. You should really rethink things, reflect before you go ahead with any major decisions, particularly related to contracts, anything that you need to put in writing, anything related to a big purchase for technology, anything related to travel. These are things that you may need to revisit when we come out of this Mercury retrograde period, or that may find roadblocks in their execution during that period. And so, to the extent possible, we want to minimize some of those things during a Mercury retrograde. So Mercury retrograde has a bit of a bad rap, especially when it comes to technology failures. We think of things just not working, somehow being disrupted, which again, we have this storm that comes in. All of a sudden, the electric powers, the electric grids, the generators are just being overwhelmed. There's so much demand on the systems and they're so strained. And there was this massive failure of the system. And when we look at Saturn, what is Saturn? Saturn is the system. It is the limitations. It is the rules and regulations. It is the constraints. If we look at medical astrology, we usually associate Saturn with like the bones or the skins or the connective tissues. It is the system at large. It is that which contains. If we look at Mercury in the same regard, it is the nervous system, the communications, the neurons that are firing. And so we have this massive system-wide electrical failure that occurs suddenly. Uranus comes in, right? Sudden system-wide failure. And so our electricity, our communications, our power goes down. And again, bringing in that Prometheus and Uranus correlation of fire, that is the power. The power is gone. The heat is gone. Just how perfectly that really fit with what was going on that day. Well, technically the square perfected on the 17th, but this was a week-long issue. It still has not really been resolved. It's getting better, which is fantastic, but it is still exposing a major flaw within the system. And I think that goes and speaks to the larger conversation of Saturn and Uranus, which is exposing the weaknesses in our systems, coming in and uprooting something. Uranus uproots. Uranus it's the Fool card. It's taking that next step forward. It's taking that journey. It's stepping into the unknown, ready to venture to the next thing, progressive energy. But it also, in many ways, reminds me of the Knight of Swords card, who just rushes on in, waving his sword, ready to do. That's that sword action energy. It's the thoughts, words, and deeds. And we have the Knight, the immature energy that just wants to plunge ahead. He's like the Nike battle cry, just do it. And so it's coming in and is just uprooting the system and exposing all these flaws and saying, see, look at this. I found your weakness. You failed. Saturn, you need to come in here. And Saturn comes in and it looks at the foundation and it says, yes, let's build a stronger foundation. The Saturn cycle. Saturn, the card associated with that would be the world. In traditional astrology, it is the last of the visible planet. It's the gatekeeper between the visible and the invisible, the known and the unknown, whereas Uranus is the first of the outers, the beginnings of the unknown. But Saturn is the known, the edge of the known, the limits of the known. And the world card, which comes at the end of the cycle. Now you've learned the lessons from the major arcana, the Fool's Journey. And if you learned what you were supposed to, great. We can start the new lesson. Uranus comes in, the Fool steps in and says, okay, new lesson to learn. Let's repeat it a cycle and learn something new this time. But if we didn't learn the lesson, if Uranus comes in, the Fool steps back in and says, oh, we didn't learn the lesson, then we're doomed to repeat it. What we need to do now that Uranus has stepped in and exposed this, right? We need to go back and address these issues, the connective roots. How are they flawed? How can they be made stronger? How can we repair the foundation? Saturn teaches us, focus on the foundation, build a strong foundation. And then next time, maybe we can weather the storm. So I really thought that was just a fascinating event, how that correlated with what was going on astrologically at the time. The Fool card, I wanted to touch on that a little bit more with that Uranus energy as well. The Fool can represent a new journey. Mercury retrograde, bad time for journeys. Sometimes the Fool, while he's hopeful, he can appear to others as foolish. Again, don't know how closely you were following with some of the news cycles coming out this week, but one of the senators in Texas, Senator Ted Cruz, was definitely put on notice by the media and caught a bit of flack for a personal vacation he attempted to take, or did actually go on, at least for a short period of time, to Cancun in the middle of this crisis when his constituents in Texas were facing this disaster. So rather than canceling his vacation and being out there with his people in solidarity, he opted to get on a flight to Mexico and was caught quite publicly and called out for that, for his foolish journey. So I thought that was also a fun little coinciding that made the news, that made such a splash at this particular time. Anyway, all this to say, a lot of things definitely lined up with what was going on in the cosmos, but it was not all bad. It was definitely not good, but there was a silver lining. And we need to remember that Jupiter still remains in Aquarius. It's sort of tempering Saturn's lessons or harshness a bit, curbing that harshness, softening him. It's softening the expression of Saturn just a little bit. So Jupiter did temper the fallout. If we look a bit deeper, we find that the impetus for the blackouts really stemmed from ERCOT, the council, noticing that they were experiencing these massive failures within their generators and that demand was spiking. And they saw that they were literally minutes, I think they even used seconds, away from a total system failure. They had a few generators that were still online, and they decided that they were going to start implementing rolling blackouts. So they sort of took the grid offline temporarily and instituted these rolling blackouts, which caught people off guard because there wasn't really time to communicate that this would be occurring. They needed to shut the system down and do it decisively and swiftly. Uranus, that's swift. Got to take action. Just do it. So absolutely was a disaster. I'm not trying to minimize that. Many people, unfortunately, some lost their lives as a result of this. Just not being prepared to handle these temperatures and the lack of power and not having backup systems in place. It was an absolute tragedy, but they did manage to take the grid offline, granted for longer than they wanted to. They were hoping it would be a rolling short-term blackout. It ended up turning into days long, which is calamitous, but not the absolute total disaster that they were facing had they waited for those additional generators to fail. And then that would have resulted in a true system failure, everything offline, without any reserves, without any backups, leaving the state defenseless and powerless for, I mean, indefinitely, really. But I think they were projecting it would have been months until they got everything back online, as opposed to days or weeks. So that is this little silver lining there, that we did still have that Jupiter in there to cushion the blow somewhat, especially in a year that has seen so much tragedy and so much one thing after the next after the next. So I do want to just sort of make sure that we aren't too hard on all the players. It was absolutely a terrible situation, absolutely a failing, but there are lessons to be learned, and there are always things to be thankful for and grateful for, that it was not worse than it was, despite being terrible and tragic already. So anyway, I just thought that that was a really fascinating little case study. I thought that I would share that with everyone and put it together this maybe shorter than usual episode, but I think that we can expect that we're going to see some more of these things playing out with the conversation that we're going to find between Uranus and Saturn over the next year. So again, this is just the first time that we have this square between Saturn and Uranus perfecting this year. It will happen again in June, and then it will happen one last time at the end of December, I think December 24th. So I think this is definitely going to make us look a little bit closer. I think on a larger scale, what 2020 exposed with our 2020 dysfunctional emperor year, those boundaries, those restraints, those problems that were the big picture problems. The emperor is all about the big picture. So those big picture problems that 2020 exposed, I think 2021 will attempt to overhaul and reform that, goes in with the Uranus, to rebuild the foundations, Saturn, of our society. And all of that collectively, the overhauling and reforming to rebuild the foundations of our society, that speaks to the Hierophant, the 2021 Hierophant year. I anticipate we'll see some glimpses again in June. At that point, Jupiter will be in Pisces. It won't necessarily be in Aquarius to temper and soften the expression of Saturn, but it will be in a more functional position in terms of in its own domicile in Pisces, perhaps because it will be in Pisces, and we also have Neptune in Pisces as well. Perhaps during that period, more of a focus will be, or more of the conversation will be related to the mental health side of things, possibly substance abuse with Neptune in there, opioid crisis maybe. So that may come up again in a meaningful way, possibly as a precursor to what we can expect to see the focus on in 2022, when Jupiter enters Pisces, more fully, rather than the brief dip that it does into Pisces this year. And then really coming to a head with that third final square on December 24th at the very end of the year. It'll be really interesting. I'm curious to see how things play out. And always, I encourage you to see what topics are featuring prominently in your life during these times, because these are speaking really to the big picture, mundane themes when it comes to these transits. But on a personal level, we may not experience it in the same way. And that really speaks to everyone having their own individual natal chart. Different transits hit different people in different ways. And so look at your chart, see where these transits are hitting, what houses maybe. Are there any contacts with other planets in your chart? And how are these conversations playing out in your life? And in what areas are they playing out in your life? And that can kind of give you a better sense of how certain transits on a big scale may impact you in a more meaningful, substantive way on your personal life, and in a potentially very dramatically different way. Always a great exercise to look at some of these transits, see how they work in on your day-to-day. If in any meaningful way, make note of that and just continue those observations, because that's how we really get that understanding of these transits and their impacts on us, is through observation. And astrology not being an empirical science, but it is something that we can just observe and make correlations that potentially are significant and meaningful to us on a personal level. So I always encourage people to do that. And if you are interested in learning more about tarot, astrology, please feel free to check out my website at learntarology.com. You can book a reading, or I do have a new Foundations of Tarology class, so feel free to join that. I hope to see you there. If you are interested, please feel free to check out my website, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, take care.